Today we are having a congressional candidate, Bill Schafer, for an interview who is running for Iowa's 3rd Congressional District. Thank you for being on the show.
Alexander, I really appreciate the opportunity. It's always great to talk to every audience possible about why it's important that we deliver conservatives to the U.S. Congress.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I can. I always like to start my story by telling folks I didn't grow up in Iowa. I chose to become an Iowan. I like to say that I am American by birth, a soldier by profession, and an Iowan by choice. My father was a soldier. He spent 23 years in the Army, and then I went in, and I had to outdo him, so I did 32 years in the Army, and that results in a family that moves around a lot. My siblings, all born in different places. My children, I have 3, all born in different places, and family is spread out. And so when the active Army brought me to Iowa for an assignment at a general officer headquarters that does Army Reserve and Guard readiness, my wife and I, when it came to retirement, we decided to stay. And so we stayed in Iowa because the people were awesome. The climate, although some would like to argue with me, is pretty awesome year round. I'm an outdoor kind of guy. And so there you have it. We stayed in Iowa. Robin and I have been married for 36 years, and our children are all adults. One's in Georgia, one's in Arizona, and one recently moved up here and is with us right now, making a career change. So what's important, I think, to know about the Army career, 32 years, retired colonel, certainly a combat veteran, decorated combat veteran. I do have 2 awards of the Bronze Star for Valor, along with a combat infantryman's badge, and the experiences of commanding soldiers from a company in Desert Storm through a battalion in the current Iraqi conflict. And then I've also worked at the 3 and 4-star level as a staff officer, a chief of staff, an operations guy. So experiences that would lend themselves well to be a policy analytical type person.
So why did you choose to run for Congress as a Republican?
Well, I'm a constitutional conservative, and it is a 2-party system. I align more with the Republicans certainly than any other party that's out there. And I also believe that Iowa is a conservative state, and for the most part, the Iowans are looking for conservative representation. So last year, when Iowa lost 2 of the 30 or so seats that caused the House to flip Democratic.
Yeah.
I was looking at, well, I wasn't looking at anything. My buddy and I were talking with our wives, and he challenged me at sort of, we need you to run for office. And, that caused me to start thinking over the next couple of weeks that, I've always considered myself a problem solver. I've certainly solved a lot of problems within my career, and I always had great Americans around me helping me solve those problems. And here I am sitting at my table complaining about something, complaining both about the leftward shift of our Democratic Party, the leftward shift of our country due to representative leftward shift, as well as Iowa losing those 2 seats. And I decided maybe that is the right thing for me to do right now, because I am in a position where I can do it. Now I have to quit my job to do it, but still I have my career, and my wife and I are secure in our future. So I called that same friend up and said to Steve, I'm going to do this run if you're on my team from the start to the finish. And without any hesitation, he said, I'm on board. And I said, well, you're now the campaign manager. So there you have it. We got started on it. And that's why I started the run. But the reason is to deliver constitutional conservative values back to this district, and to deliver a conservative into the House that will help strengthen the few conservatives that we have there to achieve conservative governance. And if I can finish, just to elaborate on what that means, it's not just words. Constitutional conservatism means that if you deliver me to the House of Representatives for Iowa's Congressional District 3, I will be a constitutional problem solver. Every problem that we talk about, every policy we talk about, the first question we ought to be asking ourselves as Americans is, who owns the responsibility? Well, the Constitution and the design of our federal republic is pretty clear. The federal government is supposed to be limited to the things in the Constitution: national security, international trade. And if it's not in the Constitution, then we, the people, need to stop looking to the federal government to solve the problem. And our representatives and our senators certainly need to stop trying to deliver answers to problems that should be pushed back down to the states.
Yeah, I completely see why you're running as a Republican. The only reason why I asked that question is because the Republicans and Democrats increasingly seem to want to spend more of taxpayers' money, want to do various things, but it sounds like you're more of an independent Republican, so that's good to hear.
Well, I think I am, but again, I like to emphasize that constitutional piece because I want people thinking about it. There's a couple of things I hope I can change the dialogue on. One is talking about conservatism. The other one's talking about our federal government. And if you believe those two things before you ever argue any policy, before you talk about whether we agree or disagree on a particular topic, we should be able to agree constitutionally whether or not we want to destroy the federal republic, and frankly, even go to a democracy, let alone a socialist type society.
Okay, so how will you end homelessness in Des Moines, Iowa?
Oh, so I appreciate that question, and my answer to that's going to be, as your U.S. representative, I don't have an opinion on homelessness in Des Moines, Iowa. Homelessness in Des Moines, Iowa belongs to the mayor of Des Moines and the governor of Iowa. As an Iowan, I will, if asked, I will provide my opinion to my state representative, my state senators, and otherwise, if I'm in the Congress, I would certainly be able to have access to the governor more routinely than a citizen, possibly. So I could provide my insights to her, and I could provide her the opinion of the folks that are in my district.
Okay, so will you make a school choice bill when elected to Congress?
Well, that's a great starting point. A school choice bill is certainly something I would support, but Mike's starting position is going to be to get the Department of Education at the federal level out of education altogether. I know that's hard. Keep getting told from the party folks, that's hard, it's never going to get done. Well, it's hard, yes. It'll never get done only if we don't try. So I will be working on that because I don't believe, arguably you could get rid of the Department of Education at the national level. That may not be a good idea. There may be a role for a very small Department of Education that provides guidance to the country, no directives, no requirements, no distribution of money that allows them to control education. But if the federal government is on the ball and they change what they do to be an analytical team that forecasts the future, so they could be looking at what does the country need in 4 or 5 years, maybe 10 years, and they could be providing point papers, if you will, or information papers. We used to call them white papers in the Army, to the states, not directives, but point papers to the state governors and say, hey, here's some needs we see the country needing as a whole, whether it's, technicians or doctors or laborers. And then the states could guide their educational or write their educational guidance to incorporate that information from the federal government. That would be my approach. Short of that, I would absolutely support a pro-choice or a school choice bill.
Yeah, that's what I really would like to see, is basically kind of like a voucher type thing, because the problem with the public school system is that the public schools get the $20,000 or whatever amount of money it is for the child, and then they want to keep as much money as they can, so they use less things in teaching. So I thought maybe a way to make it more competitive would be giving that $20,000 to the student, to the parents of the student, to be used only on education. And that'll make it, what do you think of that?
No, I absolutely support it. Again, my preference would be that that is something that's done at the states because the state would be in full control of the education for the state. And I would still support a state level bill that allowed a voucher system. I think you're spot on that one of the huge issues is that, folks who want to provide an alternative to their kids, private school or online schooling, and they incur a cost to do that, they're still paying the taxes that run the schools. So I think it's a very fair observation to give them an option. But I would like to separate it from the federal government. I would support it at the federal level, short of eliminating the Department of Education.
So, what is your plan for ending crime in the United States?
Well, I'm going to give you the same answer. The federal government, your U.S. representative, doesn't have a role in local crime. It's not their job. So I don't know that trying to provide an answer that says I can end crime because you get me to Congress is the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Congress has some role in oversight of the federal executive branch, FBI, so federal level crimes and that kind of thing. And I would certainly be willing to participate in federal level crime bills that pertain to federal crimes.
Yeah.
But the short answer is, as a U.S. representative, it's not my job to try to solve God, I hate those terms, not my job. It's just not my role to try to solve crime in Des Moines or crime in Iowa or crime across the country as a whole.
Well, the only reason why I asked that question is that the federal government is putting a lot of people in prison for small drug offenses, when I think that it would be better if we put some of the bigger criminals who are doing heinous crimes against the American people and God in prison. But
Yeah,
but I definitely understand where you're coming from, though. So, do you support red flag gun laws?
absolutely not. Appreciate that question because again, if you listen to my opening comments, and if you read my opening stuff on my webpage, it's all starts with the Constitution. It
Yeah.
starts with constitutional based problem solving. And problem solving in and of itself, right? So first you have evil. You have a crime committed. Somebody commits an evil, heinous act of murder. Well, first of all, that's already illegal. We all know that. Second of all, banning the tool doesn't stop the crime. So you're already not stopping the problem. Now, these folks that want to talk, especially Republicans that want to talk about red flag laws, that is an attempt to appease a certain voting bloc, to assume that if I can show some level of negotiation or some level of reaching across the aisle, and then I might be able to secure a few more votes from this particular voting bloc that thinks it sounds good to ban certain things or to allow, or in this case, to allow the authorities to come in and take property away from somebody based on a quote unquote red flag. Well, there's a lot of problems with that. It's going to violate at least 4 of our first 10 amendments, right? You're already going to violate the Second Amendment because you're infringing on my right to own guns. You're going to violate the Fourth and the Fifth Amendment, which talk about due process and talk about your right to privacy and in your things and in your stuff. And I would argue that it's also a violation of the Eighth Amendment, which talks about undue fines. And in this particular case, while you wouldn't technically being fined, you'd certainly have to hire a lawyer to go get your property back. So
Yeah.
the idea that just because somebody complained about you or just because somebody thinks they observed something about you, they can now tell whether it's a police officer or a social worker or whoever, who's gonna make that call to come take your property or come do something to you without a valid charge, without a valid warrant, and therefore due process. Those that tell you they can write due process into such a bill are lying to you. You can't achieve due process after the fact.
I completely agree with what you said. And do you think the whole negotiation with the communists is the reason why Trump wants to support this red flag gun law?
I'm pretty sure he backed off on supporting it, and I hope he did. But yeah, I think that's the answer. I think potentially he's getting advice, and potentially he is coming to the conclusion that, a red flag law or even the banning of bump stocks, that's another red herring on the problem, would appease a certain portion of our country, um, and give at least the appearance that we're attacking the problem. I don't believe in that. I don't believe in giving the appearance that I'm doing something. I don't believe in um, attacking something that isn't the problem. You can't solve murder by banning weapons, banning tools, and you can't solve murder by randomly selecting folks to take their property away from because of an accusation.
Okay, so how will you stop election fraud on the federal level?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have the answer to that. That's going to require a lot of studying on my part. I think one of the clear answers is, and this would be attached to national security, and I'm sure you're going to ask me a national security question here shortly. So I think a national ID card would make a lot of sense, and that might then be able to translate into a more secure voting apparatus. But I don't have a off the top of my head answer to how to solve the voting fraud.
Yeah, I think most of the problem comes from the dead people voting and the illegal aliens, as you were saying, being able to vote because they can get driver's licenses. I don't know if you know this, but in Venezuela, they actually had these election booths that were digital, electronic, and they were able to change it so the votes always went to Maduro. And they actually brought that to LA, that same voting thing. But although I kind of get what you're saying with the national ID, I'm not sure it is the answer, though, because I think it could potentially be used to track the American people. What do you think?
Yeah, there's always a concern with the ability to track folks, but we are where we are in 2020. We already have driver's licenses. We already have a lot of identification requirements that allow us to be in certain databases. So even folks that are completely off the grid, they still have a social security card that they had no control over being issued to them when they were born. So I think that is a concern. And, maybe the way to mitigate that is, while it would be a national standard, it would be a state-run program. Maybe it would just be in addition to your driver's license that would allow it to become a national tool.
Would you get rid of Social Security? Would you make a bill to try to get rid of Social Security, the system?
But I don't know if I would support that bill, but I would certainly support the idea of transitioning away from Social Security. In 19, oh, what year was that when we created Social Security? I would have absolutely voted against it. Would have absolutely voted against the federal government creating that system. But 70, 80 years later, you can't just get rid of it. There's too many folks that unfortunately depend on it. So it would take a long transition time
Yeah.
where and really I'm talking about a long time. We're talking about probably a 50-year transition where, folks between 20 and 30 could opt out of it right now. And maybe folks between, I'm kind of making these ages up, but maybe folks between 30 and 50 could opt out of half of it, but still keep some of their taxes going into it. And the folks between 50 and the end of life could still maintain the whole thing. But I would absolutely entertain and would enjoy being part of that analysis to figure out how we could transition away from it. But a bill that just said we're going to eliminate Social Security would not be feasible.
Yeah, that makes sense what you're saying on that. So I see a lot of people on the internet are getting banned. Censorship is rampant. I see a lot of people in Iowa getting banned. So will you stop internet censorship when elected to Congress?
No. As a U.S. congressman or a U.S. senator or the president of the United States, you have no role in censorship. Matter of fact, the First Amendment is very clear. The Congress shall pass no law to infringe your right to free speech and all the rest of the portions of that, religion and peaceful assembly. So I would absolutely not support it. That's one of the things we got to do. Again, get back to that my pitch on federal representation, on our federal republic, on our Constitution. We, the people, need to hold these folks accountable. We, the people, need to cause businesses to make changes, not look for laws to force behavior. And you do that through free market capitalism.
Well, I do have what I think on that, though, is with the internet censorship and everything, I think the government should step in because these companies are picking and choosing who they're censoring. And we already have a law in place stating that they can't do that. And that is the First Amendment for freedom of speech. I think our founders would be horrified to see people being censored on the internet.
I agree with that second half, but there's nothing in the First Amendment that says I can't impact your freedom of speech. I'm saying it's right, saying the First Amendment doesn't say that. It says that the Congress will not interfere with your right to freedom of speech. So now you've got to run that balance of where do you want the federal government interfering with the company's right to freedom of speech. Censorship is a problem, and the only way that would make sense to me for the federal government to get involved in it is if we came to the conclusion that it was a monopolistic kind of capability, and the federal government would have a role in not allowing a monopoly to control our lives. So I'd be very cautious about how I wanted to approach allowing the federal government to get involved in that.
Yeah, it's definitely a huge issue and an important one. So, do you support term limits?
Yes, term limits are, I think, critical to the future of the country. In order, the reason that I support term limits is, number one, I'm not a big fan of career politicians. I think that our country was built on servant representation, servants of the people going to Congress to represent their people, and then returning home. And so my first thing is I don't like the idea of career politicians. Folks should learn to be servants again. Second thing is when folks go to DC and they spend 30 or 40 years, or even for that matter, probably as soon as they start breaking about the 10-year mark, they get more and more removed from the people they're supposed to be representing. So no matter how good they are, you've got a distance being created just by the sheer lack of time you're back home living there. You become a living in DC kind of person. The third piece is, of course, without accusing anybody of fraud, I just find it interesting that our politicians can go to DC and become very, very wealthy. That bothers me. So there's one final piece of it. A lot of folks that I talk to out here in Iowa, they make a great point to me that, well, we have term limits, we can just vote them out of office, and that caused me to do some thinking on it. I say, yeah, you know what, my Iowans are right that are saying that. But then I started thinking about it, and no, not under this party system that we have. When the parties don't deliver primaries, open and fair primaries where everybody knows that there is more than one candidate to pick from, and they deliver the candidate, which they're trying to do in my district right now. They're trying to deliver a former politician into the seat. Then, of course, if he does successfully get through the primary, I can't vote him out because he's going to be the Republican. Not nearly as conservative as me, not nearly as strong-willed on topics, and he's a middle-of-the-road kind of finding guy. But I'm still going to support him because otherwise I deliver the far-left liberal back to the seat. So the party is going to have to deliver fair and open primaries before I consider going away from my term limit pitch. But I think term limits is very important to the country.
Will you make the American people sovereign again?
That's a great, I love the way you asked that question. You fired me up. Absolutely. That is, again, 32 years defending the Constitution, defending this country, going to unpleasant places overseas to make sure that we're secure. And I sit here in the country, watching our borders and watching our even some of the legal folks come in and overstay their legal right to be here, breaking our sovereignty on a daily basis. I would absolutely back the president, absolutely lead the Congress, the House side anyway, into delivering the funds required to secure the border, the funds required to resource the Border Patrol and ICE, not just funds, but the stuff that they need, and then create land ports of entry. Just like we have air and sea ports of entry, we can have land ports of entry on our southern border that allowed folks to legally enter the United States for business, short term, or for long term reasons that were legitimate, and then they could return home. That is separate, completely separate from legal immigration, which is part of our history, although falsely portrayed by most of our media and most of our politicians. Legal immigration is an important part of our history and important for our future. So again, and now we're talking about a federal level responsibility to set the immigration policy, to have the appropriate metrics, not metrics that say you got to be rich to come into the country, but metrics that include, kind of like my pitch on school, what type of skills do we need to come into the country? Whether it was farm workers or computer technicians or doctors, it doesn't matter as long as it's set and it's clear and those folks apply and they follow the immigration process. And here's part of the key. They have to be intent on immigrating to become Americans. They can bring their culture with them, just like the Italians did, and just like the pick a ethnicity did, and that's fine. But they need to become Americans with that culture with them. And I would support that kind of reform on our legal immigration plan.
Well, that's good. So one of the things that I look back in history is in America, just looking at the Wild West, during the cowboy days, everyone had a gun. Everybody could protect themselves. Everyone was sovereign. Really, there was much less crime because everyone had a sidearm. So would you try to, as a Congress member, get rid of these federal gun laws and restore our republic's sovereignty?
Well, I mean, I'd have to look at each federal gun law to know if we should get rid of it or not. But in general, I think most of them should go because crime is already illegal. Stealing is illegal, even if you do it at the point of a gun. So the answer to that is probably yes. I would have to look at each one of them. But I can tell you this, I'd absolutely support a constitutional carry law that got rid of all these state licensing requirements,
Yeah.
which are just another tax. I went down and renewed mine the other day. My wife got one, and my daughter got her first one. Cost us $50 a piece to go exercise our Second Amendment right. It doesn't make any sense. And for what? Where does that money go? It's just a tax that goes into the coffers and is used for whatever. It doesn't make any sense. And then of course, other states choose not to acknowledge that carry permit that I have from Iowa, which is constitutionally wrong. The Constitution says that they're supposed to reciprocally accept each other's licensing and stuff. But I think a constitutional carry would eliminate all that and stop making us law-abiding citizens have to get a permission slip to exercise our rights.
Yeah, it's like getting permission from King George III. You have to pay all this money. So I think you're really spot on there. And what you want to do in getting rid of these permits and these licenses to help restore American power.
Absolutely.
Okay, so will you make abortion illegal in the United States at the federal level?
Abortion is abhorrent. I'm absolutely a pro-life candidate, a pro-life person, I should say, more importantly. Um, so let me answer that question this way. First, we got to change the conversation again. We got to stop allowing this soft language that makes people get emotional or makes them get compassionate with things like, women's health care. I mean, I guess it's women's health care, but it's also babies' health care now. So there's two human beings that have a health care need. Reproductive rights, that's a complete misuse of words. Your reproductive rights start and end before you decide to take the physical action that creates reproduction. You can choose not to and not get pregnant, or you can understand that there are potential consequences with doing this act that results in reproduction. So absolutely not acceptable to me to use soft language like that to get away from the evil that is abortion. I am concerned with those of us that are pro-life as we talk and we sound dismissive of victims of rape, victims of incest, which is rape by somebody you know pretty much, or a family member. And of course, then you have the health of the mother. So I think if the mother's life is in danger, which is, a very small percentage of pregnancies, but if the mother's life is in danger, I think um, she needs to be able to have a vote in whether or not she lives or dies. I think with rape and incest, we have to be careful to not sound dismissive of the trauma that those folks went through, because they're going to revisit that trauma. They're going to revisit that trauma for the entire length of the pregnancy, and probably further into their life. Now, when I say that, sometimes pro-life folks go, well, automatically he's defaulting to an exception for abortion, and I'm absolutely not. What I'm saying is, as we talk about, abortion being evil and abortion not being the right thing to do, we need to also talk about how we're going to care for a person who's been traumatized. And that care could include options for adoption. It could include psychological care, to make sure that this person own mental health isn't at risk. So I think it's very important that we don't just say pro-life, but we say pro-life with compassion for victims, traumatic event that would
Yeah.
be. There's one more piece I think that's also very important. When we propose a bill to make abortion illegal at the federal level, and I do believe this is a federal issue as well. It's linked from our Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, life, to the Constitution, which guarantees, codifies our laws to protect that Declaration of Independence. We're going to have to determine where we can get it passed at the federal level, and I think that's somewhere between conception and the heartbeat. And I don't know exactly where it is, but I think that's where we have to be willing to talk in order to, yes, the answer to your question, get it done at the federal level.
You would at least stop federal funding for abortion.
Absolutely.
Okay. So basically, one of the things that I've thought about this, what you said about in rape and incest. Well, I just remember a quote, and it's a very old quote: "Don't judge the son for the sins of the father." So I really do believe we should have a lot of compassion for these people. We should try to, if they want to be in a program to help themselves mentally, then I think we should provide that. But I don't think it's ever the baby's fault for what happened to them. The
Yeah.
baby is not the guilty party. So that's why I believe they should be able to live and have the chance of life that everyone should have.
Yeah. That's why I like to try to get through that whole piece, uh, because pro-life folks often just dismiss it and assume I'm talking abortion. I'm absolutely not advocating for an abortion for a rape victim or even an incest victim. I am advocating that as we talk about, you need to allow this person to have birth, to be given birth. Um, the person that we have in front of us does need to be recognized as having a legitimate traumatic problem physically and emotionally. They're going to have huge challenges. Now, abortion doesn't solve that problem either, but I think we make a mistake as pro-life folks when we just go, you're pregnant, you're going to have the baby, because that causes folks who have had a mental health trauma to not want to seek help because they don't think they're going to get help. So I think we need to be careful, and we need to be a little bit more compassionate as we articulate the protection of that baby.
I completely agree with what you're saying, because that is a huge mental trauma, and those people who do those evil things should be punished. So I want to ask you another question. Would you recommend young people going into the military at this point?
Yes.
Okay. So that brings me to my next question. Are you beholden to any entity, including the Vatican or the military?
No.
Okay.
I would never be beholden to anybody.
So you're your own man. You're not going to take any money from any person.
No. People can donate into a campaign like this, unaware to the candidate. So, but no, I'm not going to take money for favors, I think is what you're really asking me. No one is going to control where I go. I'm not going to change. And I can guarantee you this, I won't go there and come out richer than I am. I absolutely will not allow somebody else to tell me how to represent the people of this district, except for the people of this district.
Well, that's good. So when elected to Congress, will you make a bill to arrest traitors such as Hillary Clinton and among other people?
I got to tell you, I think that the laws that we think were broken are already on the books. We don't need, I don't believe, another bill to address the issues that we believe happened over the course of her career or the course of any of these politicians' career. What we need is politicians that have the ability to hold each other accountable, and not linked to your last question, and not because they're holding to somebody else, overlook it and not do something about it. And I can tell you that the Army career that I had would validate that, as there were several times in my career where I had to or was part of a group of officers that had to hold other folks accountable for poor behavior within the military as a unit or as individuals. And that's what we need, I believe. Again, I'll look at it. If we need a new law, I'd absolutely support writing it. But I'm not gonna suggest that I would absolutely write that law sitting here today, because I'm not a big fan of just adding laws to the books.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So once you are elected to become a congressman, will you take the United States of America out of the United Nations?
The question, I mean, that for a U.S. congressman to say yes is kind of naive. There's 435 of them, 100 senators, and really the person who has the most say on the United Nations is the president, because that's national security level stuff. It's a role of the executive branch. Would I support the U.S. pulling out of the United Nations? Yes, but short of that, I kind of like what the president's doing while he's mostly in Europe, but trying to hold other countries accountable for funding their portion of these conglomerations of nations.
The reason why I ask you that is if you would make a bill to pull us out, because when I look at the United Nations history, I really don't see it stopping any major wars at all. And I think it sometimes, with many politicians, they allow the United Nations laws to supersede the Constitution.
Yeah, I do believe we have had politicians that would allow the United Nations. Well, we have one world-minded folks, citizens of the world-minded folks. We've elected a few over the years, and it's pretty scary. But our republic has withstood all those, and we always seem to be able to kind of come back toward America with examples like our current president, who's absolutely America first, regardless of the United Nations or NATO or any of these other alliances, and I think that's good. Um, the United Nations doesn't do a lot of good. I don't know if it was designed to get folks out of war or not. It doesn't do a lot of good, but the opportunity for the nations to talk may be something we don't want to just shut down completely.
So have looked at George Washington's farewell address, and he really tells the American people in that address to stay out of foreign affairs. So would you consider yourself, like George Washington, being an isolationist?
No, no, a huge fan of George Washington. Very impressive man, very humble man, and he was the right man at the time for our country. But no, in our modern times, the idea of being an isolationist is not going to um, lend itself well over time.
Okay. So I'm going to read a little quote, and I want to ask your response to it.
It, let me throw another sentence in there. I mean, if you read the context of that address you referred to, uh, there is a contrast between meddling in others' affairs, which we have done, and I would try to pull us out of meddling in others' affairs, and being in places where it is of national security. And national security spans economics and international trade and stuff like that. And our need to be not isolationist in that part of the topic.
Okay, so this is a quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower. So this is what he said, quote, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of a misplaced power exists and will persist." End quote. What do you think? Do you think the United States is part of the military industrial complex, like Eisenhower said?
Yes, I think we have a military industrial complex within the country, as well as um, companies that can deliver products that are, in foreign nations. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so that brings me to my next question. I know that you were pretty far up in the military and you probably knew some of the generals as well. So I just wanted to ask you if some of the people on the top of our military are communist in nature, or is there not that element in our military?
No, there's, in my view, in the circles that I had around me for 30 years, there's no evidence of any communist leadership style or communist supporting type folks in the military. I mean, it's possible because the military is pretty big, ranging, at any given time, counting the Guard, the Reserve, active duty, 1.5 million folks. But I believe the answer to your question is absolutely not. There are, however, these are human beings, and they rise to the rank of general, and they're trained um, in military discipline. And some of them, they're certainly not all conservatives. They're certainly um, a mix of political ideologies, which officers are trained and do a very good job of hiding those. They're not hiding them, but Political ideologies do not run the army, but we work for the civilians. So we're, at any given time, these 8 years we're working for a liberal president, and these 8 years we're working for a conservative president. And so, that's going to influence the decisions they make for the Department of Defense to some degree. But absolutely not, in my view, any communist acceptance in the military.
Okay. So one of the things that I've been looking to was the war in the Middle East. And I do see that there is a lot of big oil men who are giving money to both parties, Republicans and Democrats especially. And there was a theory that the war in the Middle East could have started because of the oil wells, because we are staying in the Middle East right now. We've defeated ISIS, among many other terrorist groups. We defeated Saddam Hussein years ago. So do you think that the reason why the United States went into the Middle East was to acquire the oil fields? Is that why we're still occupying those countries?
No, there's certainly no evidence for that. You hear that kind of talk. You hear some of these folks talking about, well, no, what oil field do we own? What oil field did we take from anybody? Did we take any oil fields in 1991 in Desert Storm when we liberated Kuwait from Iraq and protected Saudi Arabia from an Iraqi incursion? I don't see the oil field that we now own. I do not at all believe that we went there to take oil. Now, did we go there partly to secure that oil and make sure that oil was available to the world on the world market? Yeah, I suppose we did. That's a the availability of oil on the world market is within our national strategic interest. Even now that we are a net exporter of energy, that doesn't necessarily mean we have enough here in the United States to supply the entire world or even the entire free world. So why would you not want the available oil in the Saudi and the Kuwaiti in the less radical countries in the Middle East? Why would you not want that oil to be available on the open market? As far as I know, it is. Now, are there American businessmen involved in that? Yeah, absolutely. Do they give money to politicians? Yeah, no doubt that they do. But no, I don't think that's why we went there. Certainly not to take oil fields from anybody.
Okay, do you think it was right to defend the Saudi Arabians when they treat their women very terribly? And there's also a huge free speech, anti-free speech thing going on in Saudi Arabia against anybody who doesn't support Islam.
Using the President Washington's words that you provided me a little while ago, I would tell you that would be meddling. Again, from a national strategic point of view, it is important for Saudi Arabia to remain a relatively friendly, neutral nation in the Middle East that does participate in the open market, specifically with oil. Would it be better if they didn't have human rights issues associated specifically with women? Absolutely, it would be. And I hope that our country continues to encourage them to make changes in support of advancing the human condition, just like this country did. But I think you have to encourage nations to make changes, not try to force them to make changes. And isolating yourself from them doesn't fix the problem.
I do understand a little bit what you're trying to say, and I do agree with some of the stuff you're saying. But just the only thing that I have against that really is that the United States of America, it's a free constitutional republic. We should shine as a shining star to the rest of the world as a great country to follow us. But I don't believe we should trade with tyrannical countries such as China, Saudi Arabia, because they're treating their people like slaves and trading with those countries helps their government, which in turn helps them control their slaves. But I do get what you're saying though, a little bit on how that may help them, but
Well, that demonstrates the complexity of it, and it shows you why, my view anyway, when politicians try to give simple answers like yes or no to a complex problem, everything you said is accurate. It's very brilliant, actually. It's very well thought out. Um, but there comes the complexities. If we isolate ourselves from Saudi Arabia, if we isolate ourselves from China, do we really solve the problems that we're identifying? It's a debatable statement, but I can tell you it's worth analyzing and not just assuming that by abandoning that we solve that particular problem. China is still going to produce, and they're still going to sell to other countries. So is it better to be working with them and then therefore trying to influence the future and making sure that, you know, we maintain a economic and a military strength?
will you abolish the Federal Reserve and the federal income tax?
That is another one where it's just too easy to say yes. Again, if I could go back to the creation of them, I think I would have voted against the creation of both of those entities. Fast forward where we are, is it a reasonable point of view to get rid of the income tax? Probably not. So what I would rather do is introduce a bill to simplify the tax code for us and truly make it more fair. I think that we all, if we're going to pay tax, we all should be paying tax. It shouldn't be anybody not. So I think I would go for a flat tax. Maybe we could go to a national sales tax instead of income tax, but I'm not sure you can get rid of the entity that then controls the money that comes into the federal government.
Yeah. So, can you tell everyone where they can find you for Congress for the people who want to vote for you?
Yeah. So I have a website. It's schaferforcongress.com, SCHAFERFOR Congress.com. On that website, there's an email. I'd love to hear from folks. I like getting guidance. I like getting educated from folks, especially in the district, but from across the nation, because, you know, as I go to work on behalf of the Iowans of District 3 here in Southwest Iowa, you know, I will also be serving the nation. And so I love to get guidance and questions, and I'll do my best to answer all those questions.
Well, thank you for being on the show. You seem to want to try to make America a constitutional republic again, something that I don't see coming from the other Republicans or the Democrats running. So I hope you can accomplish your goal of becoming a congressman.
Well, I appreciate that, Alexander. You are an awesome interviewer, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Well, thank you for being on the show.